Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of 7TV Fantasy Behind the Scenes series, where we steal ourselves on camera and charge into discussion about everything that went on with designing and creating 7TV Fantasy. I'm Eddy Price. I'll be your host today, and we're going to sort of look into the first and unique challenge that came with designing 7TV Fantasy, which was the genres. You've probably seen that in the title. Joining me for today's discussion is the ever-present and illustrious Dr. Peter Wright, who I'm sure the viewers are aware of and familiar with. But for those who don't know, Peter is the lead designer and senior editor for 7TV Fantasy, and also our tutor for the game design modules at Edgehill. Thank you for joining. How are you tonight, Peter? Are you okay?
I'm very well, thank you. And thank you for that very flattering introduction as well.
I try my best. Later. Okay, and for our next guest, we have the lovely Isabel Lovell, who is also a student on Edgehill University and 2-year designer on 7TV Fantasy. Thanks for coming, Isabel. How are you tonight?
Well, thank you, Eddie. Thank you for having me.
Good. Right, so for tonight's sort of episode, it's about genres, and I just want to quickly sort of introduce it by saying the 6 genres that we have decided on for 7TV Fantasy: pen and paper fantasy, sword and sorcery, mythic fantasy, historical fantasy, epic fantasy, and folktale. So I'll direct this first question at you, Peter, just because we've got the 6 genres. How did we just decide on those genres?
I think what we did when we first started is we looked at genres, fantasy as a whole, and tried to identify the common genres in fantasy. And from there on, we thought which sort of subgenres of fantasy fit it most closely together, because what we're trying to do is make the game cohere, actually function collectively. And that meant that there were probably going to be a couple of genres that fell outside of that. And the same thing happened when we did pulp, and we found we couldn't work in the westerns because they sat way outside the usual genres, and we couldn't work in air adventure stories and that kind of stuff. So with fantasy, science fantasy and urban fantasy really lay outside the other 6 that we chose that had a kind of coherence about them. So they were all really involved with sort of action, magic, swords, combat, that kind of thing. Whereas science fantasy was a little bit more ambiguous, and there's not a lot of kind of cinematic material or televisual material that you can call science fantasy. And then urban fantasy raised all kinds of problems because it then introduced kind of firearms in a modern setting, and balancing all of that and getting it to fit with the other 6 genres or another 5 genres didn't really work. So we dropped those 2.
Yeah, I think we realised when we started designing just how sort of broad sort of fantasy is, and trying to cut that up. There was obviously going to be some sort of overlap between profiles as well. So with sort of setting the scene of when we sort of decided to choose those 6 genres, what was the sort of process like? Did you sort of assign the research into genres before we then? So did you have an idea of that before it actually came about?
I think we had a ghost of an idea, because some genres in fantasy are really well established. So most people are aware of sword and sorcery, the barbarian adventure movie, or anything like that. I think epic fantasy, people have an idea of what that is, and then pen and paper fantasy was addressing the kind of role-playing fantasy tradition. But we could probably talk a little bit more about that and the trouble we had actually coming up with a name for that.
Yeah, that's fine. So, I mean, the research that I did was mainly sort of sword and sorcery and some epic sort of high fantasy that I knew would be sort of genres that would be included in the game. What research sort of did you do, Isabel? Like, what genres did you look into?
I kind of had a bit of a mixed bag, I'll be honest. I had some like epic fantasy in there. I ended up with a couple of like folktale ones, but I also got one of the stop motion animation, which I think fell into the mythical category in the end. So
yeah. Great, cool. So because I did obviously sword and sorcery, you did a bit of those, but when we kind of we've got those 6 genres, and then we were going to decide how to sort of build profiles and assign people into teams because of those sort of genres that we'd watched. But then we decided we're not sort of going to do that. Peter, could you explain sort of why we decided to stay sort of everyone together whilst we had those genres?
So why we didn't have separate genre teams?
Yeah, the genre teams.
I think there's a danger. I think if you get just watch one kind of fantasy, you become sort of really obsessed with just building the perfect barbarian or whatever it might be, and you lose the opportunities, the influences of other fantasy traditions. So we tried to mix them up a bit. So when people were allocated their films to watch, they got a broad range of fantasy films that then enabled them to talk to other members of the team who'd watched similar films. And rather than people working alone or independently, it became much more of a collective sort of team effort. So as Isabel was saying, she was watching some, the stop motion fantasy. We also had other students watching it as well, so they were able to talk together and kind of think about how can we build the mechanics of that stop motion fantasy into a variety of profile cards, for example. So it was really just a way of avoiding people being bunkered and isolated, just looking at one kind of fantasy.
Yeah. And those like the genres then kind of like, the way I look at it, they were kind of like structures or pillars for then designing, the profiles. Is that what you did in Pulp then? So did you do like the research and then have this sort of the genres and then go into then streamlining with those genres into the profiles? Is that similar to what happened with Pulp?
Yeah, I mean, Pulp's a little bit easier because Pulp is kind of organized by genres already. So you get the jungle adventure, you get the interplanetary adventure, you get the kind of weird menace kind of scenarios, and then you'll have your cop shows, your crime and gangster shows. So it was kind of done for us, which made it a little bit easier. Fantasy tends to be a bit more amorphous, and different types of fantasy borrowed different types of tradition from other fantasies, and a lot of it is underpinned by folklore or epic fantasy or fantasy that responds to earlier versions of fantasy. So, for example, I suppose Michael Moorcock is writing back against Robert E. Howard. So fantasy tends to be a little bit more difficult to extricate and group as separate genres.
Yeah, and Isabel, when you sort of approached sort of the writing of the profiles, did you sort of rely on the genre of those profiles that you were writing because you had the kind of the interest and the experience of watching those and sort of being influenced by those different types?
I think it depended on the profile, if I'm honest. There were some of the ones that I got that were very much, there was a lot of overlap. So I think one of mine was the trusted companion, and it just so happened that they happen to fall into numerous genres. So you have to, at that point, you have to kind of pay attention to where they most fall and, to kind of pick out the greatest stereotypes among that. But also on the flip side, I ended up with all of the fairy profiles, which were a delight to design. I did get very invested researching, folklore and different types of fae. So from that point of view, there was a lot more having to really focus in on, you focusing in on being vague, if that makes sense, because obviously you're trying to capture, a dryad that is, kind of most people who consume fantasy know what a dryad is, but you want to try and make sure you've got a bit of everybody's version of a dryad in there to make sure that you've got something that you could fit into any book or film that you would wish to play. So
no, that's really interesting, because obviously when you're designing sort of like profiles, with this holistic kind of broad brush view of it, the genres are almost kind of like counter intuitive to that kind of approach. You could just have like fantasy as its own, but with obviously the genres, it allows for sort of dynamic casting, and it helps with the way the game is played. So I'll ask this to you first, Peter, which sort of genre would you, if you got 17 fantasy now, which genre would you play first, and which cast would you go with?
Sword and sorcery, because I've been a Conan fan for a very long time. It would be the brooding barbarian would be my chosen kind of heroic star. And then I would build my cast around that. And then I quite like all of the kind of villains that you find in Sword and Sorcery. They're always almost always unremittingly evil sort of sorcerers or jealous kind of princes, usurpers, corrupt merchants, all that kind of thing. So that would very much be an appeal for me.
Yeah, I think Sword and Sorcery may have the most villains. I'm not actually fully sure on how many got allocated to which one, but obviously we've got a lot of cross genres as well. Isabel, which genre would you go with first?
To be boring, probably folktale.
Yeah.
Just because I really did, when designing the characters, I really did fall in love with it. And, you know, I've kind of come a bit full circle again. You know, as the designing process went on, I went more investigating into, you know, the epic and the mythic side of fantasy. But recently I've come back to folktale again. I've been watching loads of folktale-esque fantasy films at the moment. So, yeah, I'd probably want to play with all the pairings.
So would you say it's sort of like working on fantasy has sort of broadened your own sort of personal experience on fantasy and all the different sort of subgenres that there is?
Definitely. I mean, I come from quite a big fantasy household anyway, so I did have I think I was aware of a lot of things even if I hadn't seen them, but like because of fantasy, you know, all these films were flagged up to me that, you know, we've had on our shelf for years and actually I've never even looked at. So it has really broadened my experience of fantasy, both good and bad, I would say.
All right, brilliant. Well, just to kind of sort of wrap things up, I've got one last question for you, Peter. We touched quickly on sort of like science fantasy and urban fantasy, and I was just wondering if there's any kind of sort of ideas in the pipelines for sort of including them later, because I know there's a lot of people out there who love, you know, science fiction fantasy or the, you know, off the cuff urban fantasy, and there's a lot of people out there who would be excited to play those, as well as obviously, you know, getting the teeth into fantasy as well. So can you say anything about, you know, the future of those?
Yeah, it was a big regret really not to be able to have, have urban fantasy in there. So it's one of those things that's definitely on the slate for developing at a later date. There's just so much potential and so much fun to be had in urban fantasy. In terms of science fantasy, we've got a little idea niggling away about a different game that's going to be related to 7TV, but will be something different, very much in a science fantasy far future setting. And we're just sort of talking about the possibilities that's got really for us.
Okay, so that's a to be confirmed moment, but it's one for the 7TV fans to definitely look forward to. Well, that's enough for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed watching us all discuss genres. But yeah, that's enough for us today. Stay tuned for the next episode of 7TV Fantasy Behind the Scenes.